What if the biggest mistake in personal development is trying to fix yourself? A lot of self-improvement advice starts with the same quiet assumption that something inside you needs to be removed. Your fear, your anger, your hesitation, your doubt. You hear yourself say, part of me wants X and a part of me wants Y. So the strategy becomes simple. Identify the parts of yourself that seem to cause problems and try to eliminate them. But this approach often creates the very thing people are trying to escape, internal conflict. One part of you pushing forward, another part quietly pulling back. And the harder you try to force change, the more divided you can start to feel. This is why many capable, intelligent people spend years working on themselves, yet still feel stuck in the same patterns. In Neuro-Linguistic Programming, or NLP, there's a principle that challenges this entire approach to growth. All procedures should increase wholeness, not remove parts of you, not suppress parts of you, but bring your internal system back into alignment. And once you understand what that really means, you start approaching change in a completely different way. Many people approach personal growth like a repair project. They assume that if something in their life isn't working, there must be something inside them that needs to be fixed. So they start trying to remove the reactions they don't like. They try to eliminate fear before taking action. They try to suppress frustration in difficult conversations. They try to silence doubt when making important decisions. And for a while, that strategy can seem logical. If a reaction feels uncomfortable or seems to get in the way of results, and getting rid of it sounds like progress. But something interesting tends to happen when people take this approach. Instead of feeling stronger, they start to feel divided. One part of them pushes forward, another quietly resists. I remember experiencing this very clearly early in my career. It was a moment when I had an opportunity to speak up in an important conversation. I had the idea, I understood the situation. I knew contributing would move the discussion forward, but at the time, another reaction showed up. A voice saying, what if you say it wrong? What if the room doesn't respond well? One part of me wanted to lead the conversation. Another part was trying to protect me from potential embarrassment. I could literally feel the tension in my body, the impulse to speak and the instinct to hold back, both happening at the same time. And in that moment, the instinct was to treat the hesitation as the problem, to try to push it away. But the harder I tried to override it, the more tension I felt internally. If you ever experience something similar, you know how that feels. You're capable, you know what you want to say, yet something inside of you creates friction. Most people interpret that friction as weakness. They assume the solution is to silence the hesitation and force themselves forward. But forcing one side of yourself to win rarely creates clarity. It creates internal conflict. And the more internal conflict there is, the harder it becomes to move forward with confidence. This is where a different perspective becomes incredibly useful. Instead of assuming certain reactions need to disappear, what if those responses are actually trying to help in some way? And what if the goal of growth isn't removing those reactions, but learning how to bring them into alignment? That idea leads directly into one of the most important principles in NLP. All procedures should increase wholeness. Before we go further, it helps to understand something from the previous video in this series. In that video, we explored the idea that people already have the resources they need to succeed. The challenge usually isn't capability, it's access. If you haven't watched that yet, I recommend starting there, because it explains why the abilities we need are often already present within us. This principle we're discussing now builds directly on that idea. I've linked the video in the description below. When I talk about wholeness, it's not referring to perfection. It simply means that the different responses inside you are working together instead of against each other. Think of your mind less like a single voice and more like a team. Different responses inside you handle different things. One part of you pushes toward achievement, another watches for risk, another wants connection with people, another protects your values. Each of these responses exists for a reason. The problem isn't that these reactions exist. The problem appears when they stop cooperating. You might experience this when making an important decision. One part of you says, go for it. This is a the right opportunity for you. Another part says, wait, think this through more carefully. When these responses start pulling in different directions, people often assume something's wrong with them. They think they need to silence one side. But what's actually happening is much simpler. Your internal system is out of alignment. A useful way to think about this is like an orchestra. An orchestra contains many instruments: strings, brass, percussions, woodwinds. Each instrument plays a different role. If one instrument disappears completely, the music becomes incomplete. But when all the instruments are coordinated, something powerful happens. The music becomes clear, rich, and balanced. Your mind works in a very similar way. Different emotions, instincts, and reactions are like instruments in that orchestra. They each carry information. They each serve a purpose. Wholeness means those responses are working together instead of competing with each other. And when that happens, something interesting occurs. Clarity improves, energy increases, and decisions become easier. Not because parts of you disappeared, but because more of you is working in the same direction. That is what this principle is pointing to. Real growth doesn't come from removing parts of yourself. It comes from bringing your internal system back into alignment. Once you understand the idea of wholeness, something interesting starts to become visible. Many personal growth strategies unintentionally create the opposite. Instead of bringing the system together, they try to remove parts of it. Think about how often people say things like, I need to get rid of my fear. I shouldn't feel angry. I have to stop doubting myself. At first, that sounds reasonable. If an emotion feels uncomfortable, the natural instinct is to try to eliminate it. But most of these reactions exist for a reason. Fear often appears when something important is at stake. Anger can signal that a boundary's been crossed, and doubt can slow us down long enough to think more carefully. These reactions aren't random. They're part of how the mind tries to protect and guide us. The problem usually isn't the reaction itself. The problem is when the responses start pulling in opposite directions. Imagine someone preparing for an important presentation. One part of them wants to step forward and perform well. Another part tightens up and says, be careful, don't make a mistake. Most people interpret that tension as something they need to force away. So they try to silence the hesitation, push past the nervousness, ignore the reaction completely. But when one part of you tries to overpower another part, something predictable happens. The resistance often gets stronger. The mind doesn't easily cooperate when it feels something important is being ignored. This is why people sometimes feel like they are fighting themselves. They're trying to push forward while another part keeps pulling back. From the outside, this can look like procrastination or lack of confidence, but often it's simply an internal system that hasn't been brought into alignment yet. When we stop trying to eliminate these reactions and start understanding the role they play, something shifts. Instead of conflict, we start to see information. Instead of resistance, we begin to see signals. And that opens the door to a much more effective approach to change. One that doesn't require parts of you to disappear, but helps those parts begin working in the same direction. Let's look at a simple example. Imagine someone preparing to speak in front of a group. A few minutes before they begin, their body starts reacting. Their heart beats faster, their breathing changes, their body tenses. That's happened to me many times. Most people immediately label this as anxiety. And once that label appears, the goal becomes clear. Get rid of it. They try to calm themselves down, push the feeling away, pretend it isn't there. But what if that reaction isn't actually the problem? What if it's the body preparing for performance? When something important is about to happen, the nervous system naturally increases alertness. Energy rises, attention sharpens, the body prepares to respond. In other words, the same reaction people call anxiety can also be the energy that fuels focus and presence. This is a process that increases wholeness and doesn't try to remove the energy. Instead, it helps the person work with it. They slow their breathing slightly, they bring their attention to their goal, the message they want to deliver. They allow the energy to move forward instead of fighting it. And something interesting happens. The sensation that felt like anxiety becomes engagement. The energy that felt uncomfortable becomes presence. Nothing was removed or suppressed. The reaction was simply brought into alignment with the situation. This is what increasing wholeness looks like in practice. Instead of eliminating parts of yourself, you learn how to integrate them in a way that supports the outcome you want. So, how do you actually apply this idea in everyday life? You don't need a complicated technique. Increasing wholeness often begins with 3 simple shifts. 1, start before labeling a reaction as bad. When a reaction appears, fear, hesitation, frustration, the first instinct is usually to push it away. Instead, pause and ask, what might this response be trying to help me with? For example, if you feel nervous before a presentation, the reaction might be trying to help you prepare more carefully. If you feel frustrated in a conversation, the reaction might be signaling that something important to you isn't being respected. Once you look at the reaction as information instead of a problem, it becomes easier to work with. Studies show under MRI of the brain, the same area lights up for anxiety or excitement. Same sensation, different interpretation. Secondly, identify what the reaction is trying to protect. Most internal responses are trying to protect something valuable. It might be protecting your reputation, your safety, your time, your standards, or a relationship. For example, hesitation before making a big decision might be protecting you from moving too quickly. That doesn't mean you shouldn't move forward. It simply means there may be something worth considering before you do. When you understand what the reaction is protecting, the reaction begins to make sense. Thirdly, bring the response into alignment. Sometimes 2 different responses want 2 different outcomes. One part of you may want to move forward quickly. Another part may want caution. Alignment happens when both concerns are acknowledged and included in the decision. Instead of asking yourself which part should win, ask a better question. What action would allow me to move forward while also respecting the concern being raised? For example, if one part of you wants to take a new opportunity, but another part feels uncertain, the aligned response might be move forward with more preparation. If one part of you wants to speak up in a meeting, but another part worries about saying the wrong thing, the aligned response might be speak up clearly and thoughtfully instead of saying silent. Both concerns are included. Nothing has been pushed away. How do you know alignment has happened? When your internal system comes back into alignment, you usually notice a few clear signals. First, the internal tension decreases. You stop feeling like 2 parts of you are pulling in opposite directions. The decisions begin to feel simpler. Second, your thinking becomes clearer. Instead of mentally arguing with yourself, you start seeing a path forward. Your attention moves toward action rather than conflict. Third, your body relaxes slightly. Your breathing settles, your posture opens. There is a subtle sense of steadiness, not perfect certainty, but coherence. And finally, action feels easier. You don't have to force yourself as much. Movement happens more naturally because your internal system is no longer fighting itself. This is what increasing wholeness actually looks like. Not removing parts of yourself, but bringing your internal responses into cooperation instead of conflict. And when that happens, the energy that used to go toward internal struggle becomes available for progress. And for many people, that moment is surprisingly quiet. Not dramatic, just the feeling that everything inside you is finally moving in the same direction. This is what higher performers discover. At a certain level of growth, something important changes. People stop trying to fight themselves. They start learning how their internal system actually works. High performers eventually notice that many of the reactions they once tried to eliminate were never the real problem. Fear wasn't the problem. Frustration wasn't the problem. Even doubt wasn't the problem. The real issue was internal conflict. When different responses inside a person pull in opposite direction, energy gets split. Part of your attention moves forward, another part holds back. And that tension quietly drains focus, clarity, and momentum. But when those responses begin working together, something powerful happens. Energy returns, thinking becomes clearer, decisions feel steadier, not because pressure disappears, but because the person is no longer working against themselves. This is why experienced leaders often appear calm in complex situations. It's not that they don't feel different reactions internally, they do. But over time, They learn how to listen to those signals, understand what each response is trying to protect, and bring the system back into alignment. Once that happens, the mind begins working as a coordinated system instead of a divided one. And that's where consistency comes from. Not from suppressing parts of yourself, but from learning how to bring those parts into cooperation. When that happens, you stop spending energy managing internal conflict, and that energy becomes available for something far more useful. Clear thinking, decisive action, and leadership that feels steady even under pressure. As a master practitioner of NLP, I have a technique called parts integration. I often use this process as part of a breakthrough session. If a client's challenge to achieve their goal is indicative of a parts conflict, this process allows your unconscious mind to recognize opposing parts as a whole, resolve the conflict, and recreate a situation that integrates and honors all parts. Remember I mentioned about earlier on in my career, over time, I began looking at moments like that previous experience differently. Instead of trying to silence the hesitation that showed up before speaking, I started asking a different question. What was that reaction trying to protect? Often it was simply asking for one thing: care. It wanted the message to be thoughtful, accurate, respectful of the people in the room. Once I recognized that, something shifted. The hesitation stopped feeling like an obstacle. It became a signal to slow down for a moment, gather my thoughts clearly, and then contribute with intention. The energy that once felt like friction began to feel like focus. The caution didn't disappear, but it stopped competing with the desire to speak. Both could exist in the same moment. And when that happened, the experience felt very different. Not forced, not tense, just clear. Looking back, the change didn't come from removing part of the experience. It came from allowing those responses to work together. That's what this principle points to. Growth doesn't always come from becoming someone different. Sometimes it comes from understanding how the different parts of you are already trying to help and learning how to bring them into alignment. When that happens, you don't lose parts of yourself. You gain access to more of who you already are. The next time you notice a reaction you don't like, hesitation, frustration, doubt, try something different. Instead of asking how to remove it, ask what role it might be trying to play. You may discover that the very response you were trying to eliminate contains information that can help you move forward. Real growth rarely comes from cutting parts of yourself away. It comes from learning how to bring more of yourself into alignment. That is the essence of this principle. All procedures should increase wholeness. If this idea resonates with you, I recommend watching the previous video in the series. You are in charge of your mind, therefore your results. That concept explains how the meaning we create shape the outcomes we experience. Together, these ideas form a system, not just isolated insights. I've linked that video in the description below. Click on it next, and let's continue building your freedom to succeed.